you. My name is LaShonda White, and I work in the city manager's office. And I want to welcome each and every one of you for coming out today to our funders panel. So thank you so much for taking a few hours out of your morning to hear from some wonderful individuals that will hopefully give you some words of wisdom to help you on future grant endeavors. The city of Richmond, as many of you know, has a grant program called the ECIA grant program that stands for the Environmental Community Investment Agreement. That is an agreement between the city of Richmond and Chevron that came out of the modernization project at Chevron. It gave the city of Richmond $80 million in revenue over a period of 10 years to implement a variety of strategies. One of those strategies programs is a grant program. So we have $6 million over 10 years. We have entered into our third annual ECIA grant cycle. So for those of you who were successful in receiving a grant and are in this room, congratulations. We'll have a grant cycle every year. So be looking out for that grant in December probably of 2018 for the next fiscal year. The City of Richmond and the Richmond Community Foundation have partnered together over the last 3 years since the beginning of the grant program. They have provided us with really wonderful technical assistance and support in developing the grant program. They also have helped us with creating and developing a capacity building training session for grantees and for applicants and just for nonprofit organizations in the city of Richmond. So for this year, we have already hosted 2, and we've done some grant training, grant writing and budget overview and some other really wonderful things around social media. So we have a few coming up, but today we are having our wonderful funders panel. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking. I'm gonna turn it over to Stacy, let her introduce the wonderful panel. So thank you all again.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, LaShonda. No, I'm sorry. You guys are going to have to share the one mic. Yes, we're going to demonstrate how funders collaborate or not by sharing a microphone this morning. So I'm Stacy Street. I'm the Chief Operations Officer for Richmond Community Foundation, and it really has been our pleasure to partner with the City of Richmond on this series of workshops and panels. And it's my pleasure today to introduce all of the funders and donors that are here that are going to speak to you from their own experience. And how this developed was, as you know and you heard, we've been doing these grant writing workshops as well as an introduction to fundraising. And I really felt like it was important for you to hear directly from the donors themselves on how to build relationships, what works, what doesn't work, how to make sure that you make the right match between the needs that you are trying to meet in the community and the philanthropic priorities that each of the donors and funders in your community might have. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, is going to be all about how to build relationships and how to make the best match, because that's always how I feel fundraising really is. People ask me all the time, it must be really hard to ask people for money, and I feel like that's not really what it's all about. It's really about matching needs with resources, and that's what Richmond Community Foundation is all about. And you might have seen our restructuring email that went out, but we're really about connecting resources to the needs in our community. So this is a perfect fit for us here too, to be able to be here today. So I'm going to introduce each of them just very briefly and ask each of them to say a little bit about themselves and their funding priorities to start it off. So maybe I'll start on the end with Kristen Turek from Marin Community Foundation. And I'm also going to say you all have the bios in your program, so I'm not going to go through their very impressive bios because this is a very esteemed panel, but please read up because they are very knowledgeable. So Kristen.
Good morning, everybody. I'm a senior philanthropic advisor at the Marin Community Foundation over in Marin County, Novato. And I have been with the foundation since 2001, with a brief stint up in Vancouver, Washington, where I was a program officer and worked closely with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The reason why Stacy chose me to be on this panel is because I manage 75 clients in my portfolio, and one of the families I manage is the Fullerton Family Foundation, and they focus in Richmond and Marin. They give away about $3 million a year, and their primary funding areas are education and health and animal welfare. So about 70% of the money goes toward education, and if anybody's interested in learning a little bit more about that, I can happily share the specific strategies. And I'll get into more detail about the uniqueness of being a philanthropic advisor and having donors that are actually funding in all areas. And Marin Community Foundation, the Buck Family Fund can only fund in Marin County, but the donor advised funds can fund domestically, internationally, or in Marin. So the people I'm working with are funding throughout the world, essentially. So I'll pass it along.
And J.C. DeVera from San Francisco Foundation.
Good morning, everyone. I'm J.C. DeVera. I'm a second-year fellow at the San Francisco Foundation. I work under our Nurturing Equity Movements program area, where I help drive grant making in community organizing, civic and voter engagement, and leadership development in the Bay Area. I guess some context for the San Francisco Foundation, we've been around, we're actually celebrating 70 years this year, so we've been around since 1948. Historically, we've been supporting social justice efforts here in the Bay Area in the 5 counties that we serve, and that's Alameda, Contra Costa here, San Mateo, San Francisco, as well as Marin. Even though we've been known as a social justice funder for quite some time, I think that became even more pronounced about 4 years ago when we adopted this new racial and economic equity agenda. And the goal is really to advance racial and economic inclusion in the Bay Area to ensure that all people are economically secure, rooted in vibrant communities, and are engaged in civic life. So that has been kind of the shift that we've seen, and I think that is really to be responsive to what we heard through our listening sessions with the community, understanding that our region is experiencing tremendous economic growth, but we know that not everyone is benefiting equally, especially low-income residents and people of color. So we made it our charge and our goal to help really level that playing field. And I think I'll be going more into how we approach that later on in the panel. So thank you for having me.
And next, Raminder Somal with Wells Fargo.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Raminder Somal with Wells Fargo. I'm in our community relations group. And our Wells Fargo Foundation, our community relations team, we really have a strong giving strategy throughout our footprint. So Wells has been around since 1852, so we've been around for a little while. And specifically, each of our communities has a Raminder. And so the areas that I support specifically are Alameda and West Contra Costa County, so here in Richmond. And then I have counterparts that cover the rest of Contra Costa and Solano, and then, like I said, throughout the footprint. And our giving strategy, we really did what we call a local market priorities, where we said, what are the needs in our community, specifically with the low to moderate income community in mind? And so we assessed that for specifically Alameda, Contra Costa, and Solano counties, and assessed and said, the key needs in these communities are affordable housing, which probably comes to no surprise to anyone in this room, workforce development, helping people find a job with a living wage, small business or entrepreneurship. A regular 9-to-5 job isn't necessarily for everybody. And then lastly, education, and specifically focusing on, again, low to moderate income and helping people, students in low income communities finish high school, go on to college, finish college, and various programs and services that support those goals. Thank you.
And last but not least, Eric Zell, who represents multiple organizations. So I'll let him introduce himself.
I think I'm the odd duck here. Good morning, everybody. Again, Eric Zell. I don't work for a foundation. I don't work for a business per se that gives away money. I'm basically somebody who's been in this community pretty much my whole life, both on a personal and a business level, as well as my family. I've lived in this community for 50 years. My family was involved in this community from the late 40s. And in every case, really from the beginning, my family and myself have been very engaged in the community in lots of different capacities. Basically, from a philosophy that giving back to the community is extremely important, and that being involved in the community is very important. So without going into a lot of that background, I am a former president of the Richmond Community Foundation Board, probably over a decade ago. I'm currently the president of the Contra Costa College Foundation Board, where I've sat for 20 years and have raised over $1 million for them in that period. I run a governmental relations and public affairs business myself in Richmond that's been here for 27 years. I work all over the East Bay. But in that context, I have a lot of opportunity. My philosophy for my clients is that the way you are successful is through win-win relationships. And being part of the community in a real way, not in a fake way, being part of the community, giving back to the community is basically an important business philosophy. And it's also an important personal philosophy. If my client doesn't feel it personally, I wish they did, but I don't really care, because I want them to do it anyway, because it's the right thing to do. So I bring that pretty much into everything I do, and I'm very integrated into a lot of different things. So I think I have sort of a different role and different perspective here, but hopefully it's helpful. Thank you.
No, great, thank you. So you can see we have a really diverse range of funding opportunities here and perspectives. So I think we're going to have a really engaging conversation. So thank you all for being here. So I'm going to ask a question that anyone can jump in, but hopefully you all will answer. The reason that fundraising is often referred to as development is because it's about much more than just asking for money or securing a transaction. What, for you, are the key elements in building a relationship with an organization you might choose to support? And what are the best steps a staff member or volunteer might take to build interest to ensure a good match?
I guess I'll start since
You're
I have
holding
the
the
mic.
microphone.
So I think first and foremost, making sure you're reviewing the giving guidelines that are, generally, and I'll speak for Wells Fargo, that are available on our website, and making sure that you're an eligible organization. So as an example, we can only support 501c3 nonprofits. So there's times where a for-profit organization, or they're not quite a 50, they don't have their 501c3 status yet, as an example. So making sure you're reviewing that, and then also reviewing our giving guidelines, and seeing that you fit within our giving guidelines. So meaning, and I always pick on the poor SPCA, but the SPCA is a great organization, but that's not in our sort of focus area. So as I mentioned, housing, small business, workforce, and education. And then to a lesser extent, we do support human services organizations, so like your shelters, not shelters, food banks, clinics and such. So again, I would say making sure that you're fitting within the guidelines. I think a lot of times people say, oh, Wells Fargo, they've got a ton of money and, they can throw it everywhere. And I wish that was the case, but again, we can only support organizations that are within our giving guidelines. Above and beyond that, if you do apply for a grant, and you do have a connection with somebody, making sure that you're following up with that connection on an at least annual basis. There's times where I have nonprofits where I feel like I'm chasing them down. And so I find that okay. And again, within reason, please don't be sending me an email every week or something, but just sort of checking in with your funder and finding out how they want to be kept up to date on the work that you're doing, adding them to your distribution. And there's, unique ways that you can find opportunities to engage with your funder. I have sat on a panel with where they've done something kind of like a Shark Tank with small business owners, and I got to hear their pitch and give feedback on how they could strengthen their pitch and or what they did well. So that's a great example of connecting with your funder and being able for us to actually meet your clients. And so really, again, looking for ways to engage your funder so that you're going beyond the check. And I'll talk a little bit about that later as well.
So this is a great question, and to the point that Raminder really talked about, it is definitely important to make sure that there is alignment in terms of the mission, the strategies, and priorities. And I think a big question is like, how do we connect with our funders, right? So I feel very fortunate to be working for a foundation that really centers racial, economic, and social justice. I really came to this work by way of student organizing, and I think many of the tenets of community organizing is how we should be approaching development, both from the perspective of a funder and also as a grant seeker, right? Because community organizing at its core is all about building relationships, and building relationships based on mutual trust and respect. It's really about understanding each other's self-interests, right? Like, what are your goals, what are my goals, and how can we then collectively work on those goals together? And I think that's where the secret sauce or that really sweet spot is understanding what is that intersection of your priorities and your goals. So as a foundation, we really seek to understand how an organization's work aligns with the priorities and strategies we set out in our equity agenda, and also really gauge both the ability and the capabilities of the organization to advance that agenda, whether through their partnerships, through their different approaches, and through their capacities. So really looking and understanding that aspect. In terms of building or how can staff members or volunteers build interest? I definitely agree with, keeping your funders up to date with any important developments that might have been happening with your organization. One thing that I really like, and is my own personal approach as a funder, is to make sure that we do no harm to our grantees by making them do unnecessary things. So I don't want you to apply for a grant program if we already know that you're ineligible, or that you're not really, that you wouldn't really make the cut, right? Because that's just going to take up so much of your precious time that could be spent doing the incredible work that you all are doing. So one of the things that I really encourage prospective applicants to do is send over a short blurb, right? Something that's just a quick summary of what you hope to do and how that might align with one of the things that we're doing at the foundation. And that is a good way for us to really get an initial sense of the work and to be able to let you know, okay, this sounds like a really good fit. How about you go on and submit a full application? Or it also will come to the point where we say, we don't think this is a good fit as it currently stands based on our guidelines. So we wouldn't want to waste your time having fill out an application that might take a good amount of hours, right? So I think that would be one of the kind of pieces of advice I would have in terms of how to build interest and see if it's a good match.
Excellent. So I would just say, so Marin Community Foundation has two sides of the house. They have the Buck Family Fund, which focuses in Marin, as I said. So I'm assuming the majority of the folks in the room here are not Marin organizations. I think Community Action Marin might be here, but maybe that's the only organization. And yep, hi guys. But the people who are outside of Marin are eligible for donor advised fund funding, and those are the folks whose relationships I manage. So I would recommend, every community foundation has donor advised funds. So you can contact your local community foundations and let them know what you're doing. And I would be very strategic about the way that you're connecting with the community foundation. So I would have everything lined up in advance, like what's your mission? What are your funding priorities? What makes you different from other nonprofit organizations in the community? What are the top 3 things that donors should know about who you are and what you're doing? We, as philanthropic advisors, are matchmakers, and we want to do the best to represent you. So we my team at Marin Community Foundation probably meets with about 400 nonprofit organizations a year. And our job is to learn as much as we possibly can, as efficiently as we can, because it's hard to meet with our donors and the nonprofits. But if we don't know what you're doing, we can't communicate that information to our donors. So I would agree with what both of you guys said, which is that keeping us up to date on new developments. If you have a new staff member that you want to highlight, a new program that you want to highlight, or if you have a matching grant or some type of opportunity that would engage donors in some way. So I'd say those are some of the ways that you can continue to engage with us, and always keep your GuideStar profile up to date. That's sort of our first stop shopping when we're researching an organization we may not know about, is to go to GuideStar. And I can't tell you how many organizations do not have their information up to date, their program information, how they're measuring their successes. So I would just suggest get online and do that too. That's just an obvious no-brainer. And those are the things that are coming to mind for me right now. Eric?
Again, so I have a little bit of different filter here. I get asked for contributions. I try to raise money for causes or foundations. I have clients who are being asked to give money all the time. So when you're on the giver side, especially in the business community or others, everybody's asking you for money. So you have to have some kind of filter. Sometimes it's more formal, like here's what we're giving to and here's what we're not giving to, and sometimes there's more flexibility. There are certain basic, what I'm going to call fundamental factors that I know I look at, I advise my clients to look at, and I'm interested to know if these are things you guys look at, but I sort of boiled it down to 8 factors. One is what are the base values of the organization or the organization making the request? What are the values that they're coming from? I know we all have mission statements, but a lot of people forget about the underlying values. What are the values that these folks are really coming from? Related to that is obviously the mission, but is the mission in alignment with those values? So those are things that we're also looking at, is there alignment there, or is there not alignment there? These are not all equal. Some things, depending upon the circumstances, have different importance than others. The other is what I defined as competence, but how competent is this organization of actually achieving their mission? Are they staffed correctly? Do they have a track record? Do they have the kinds of things that show they can actually get the job done? Because nobody wants to spend money and not see it go towards the intended outcomes. And I think most people, I assume that's true for the rest of the panel, people want to see outcomes. People aren't looking, be perfectly blunt, to capacity build for an organization. What they really want to see is are they capable of accomplishing the outcome? So I mentioned the track record. I don't want to overemphasize this, but I do want to emphasize it because it's certainly true in my world, which is personal relationships matter. I know we want to believe that everybody gets their donations or their contributions based on they put together a great application. But when everything's equal, if you have a personal relationship and you know the person, it's not just that you know them, hopefully you know them and it leaves a good taste in your mouth. So likability is also a factor. If you know somebody and you go, this person's nuts, you're not like, I'm not sure I want to give them money. But if you know who they are as a person and you have enough of a sense of who they are, and you go, I can trust, because a lot of this is about trust, right? So a lot of it is, can I trust the people I'm giving resources to? Third-party endorsements in my world matter. What I mean by that is if somebody asks me for money, and I've worked with Kathleen over the years, somebody asked me for money, I know Kathleen, but if somebody asked me for money and I didn't know Kathleen, but somebody else I respect and know comes to me and says, you ought to really give to this organization for this reason, that matters. That helps. You're really trying to figure out what's the tipping point where you're going to get to yes. And all these factors matter in getting to yes, and some at different levels of importance. And the other, and this isn't always the case, but sometimes there's actually a professional assessment, not just a casual third-party assessment, but some kind of professional third-party professional evaluation of what this agency has done, and that also adds credibility. So everybody wants to put their money to the best possible use with the best possible outcomes, and the more you can raise the level of the people making the decision so that they know that the outcome is likely to happen, I think the better chance you have of being successful. This one is. That one was on. I wonder you.
Hello. Okay, this one's on. We have to have the mic because it's for the video. So I'm going to do a little bit of individual follow-up with each of the panelists because they all have such unique perspectives and experience to bring to all of you. So I was going to start with Raminder. So you have a very specific grant-making process and cycle and guidelines, but are there other ways that you might support organizations outside of that? And if so, how are those decisions made in general?
Thank you. So for the most part, our grants decisions are really rooted in what our local market priorities are. So meaning, as I mentioned earlier, affordable housing, workforce, small business, and education. However, you may have an organization where the organization itself isn't in one of those 4 areas, but they may have a program or do work in that. So that might be a way. So I'm trying to think of an example of an organization where a colleague of mine recently met with an organization that provides sort of more of human services where they connect individuals to resources like helping them get public assistance or helping them sign up for WIC. But part of what they're doing also is helping them find affordable housing. So we might be able to say, well, that element we might be able to support. So that's one piece. Above and beyond that, Wells is always looking for supporting an organization outside of the check. And what I mean by that is with every single organization that I meet with, I always talk about what we can do to follow through on doing financial education workshops, volunteer, having someone join the board. And unfortunately, not everyone follows through with that. I would say more often than not, they don't. And so that's one way to engage. So like I say, I have my routine conversation with them about, we can do financial education, we can volunteer. And like I said, that's another way. And again, Wells is a huge employer. So that's a way for us to connect with your organization. So you might say you're doing a backpack giveaway and you need volunteers to come out and assist with giving out the backpacks or doing a diaper drive or something like that. So those are ways that we can engage and I can try to make a connection happen. And that's another way. The last one that sometimes happens is I might say, you know what, you're not really in our focus area, but I might know of, have you talked to Marin Community Foundation? Have you talked to San Francisco Foundation? And I often do say that with organizations. And okay, Wells is one bank. Have you talked to any of the other banks? And then also other nonprofits. So just a couple days ago, I met with a nonprofit that is trying to build affordable rental housing for veterans. And they're a relatively new organization. And so I was asking them, well, okay, are you connected with Operation Dignity? Are you connected with Abode? So we may not be able to support them, kind of to your point earlier of, they're really at their early stages and we're not in the business of giving for capacity building, but we might say, hey, I'd love to connect you with these organizations And as you kind of get established, or to see how you can partner with these organizations, so that we're not sort of reinventing the wheel. So that's another way that I think we try to support an organization.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Raminder. So you can see there are lots of ways that you can seek support from funders and donors in our community beyond just asking for a donation. So thanks for sharing those examples. So JC, with the San Francisco Foundation's new focus on racial and economic equity, would love to hear a little bit more about how specifically that influences your funding, not just in your main application process, but if you have any insight around your donor advised funds too. And I know we're going to dig in a little more into that with Kristen as well. And anything that you might have to share about how it might have changed your policies and focus. And then also just anything else you want to add that we might not have covered?
No, this is a great question, so general and broad. So in short, our equity agenda, I think what it has allowed us to do is become more focused, clear, and bold on what we will and will not fund. We've moved away from the traditional kind of issue-based siloed approach to funding. We used to have 6 different distinct issue areas: community development, housing, community health, arts and culture, and so forth. And now we've really moved and restructured into now what we call 3 interconnected pathways to equity, which we call people, place, and power. That really outline the specific strategies we hope to support through our grant making. And so for those that are new, or if this is the first time that you've heard of the San Francisco Foundation's new approach, I'm going to kind of go through what those 3 things mean, right? So through people, we intend to expand access to economic opportunity by eliminating the barriers that cause folks to not attain those economic opportunities. So we do a lot of our intentional grant making in issues such as criminal justice reform, education equity, workforce development, and transit justice. And then through our place pathway, I think that really speaks to the issue of the day that we see here in the region, which is the rapid kind of impact of gentrification and displacement on especially Native communities or Native residents that have been here for the longest time. So a lot of the work that we support through that portfolio is about preserving, protecting, and producing affordable housing. And then in addition to that, it's really about how do we also preserve and protect the cultural vibrancy that makes the Bay Area the special place it's been. So that's also where a lot of our arts and culture funding lives now. And then Power, which is the program area that I'm a part of, is kind of like the relatively new iteration of what we're doing as a foundation. And it's really about building the voice and power of low-income residents and people of color here in the Bay. Knowing that we want to get affordable housing, knowing that we want to get education that is equitable for our students, we need to really make sure that we actually have the base and the base of folks here in the Bay Area that are going to be able to act on all of that, right? So all of our grant making within the Power pathway is focused on community organizing, civic and voter engagement, as well as leadership development. So that's kind of the summary of how we're approaching our grant making right now. And to kind of show how that's changed some of our processes, for our last open cycle, our last open call for applications to our equity grants program, instead of asking applicants to select a pathway, we asked them to select strategies because we understand that people's work touches on a variety of things, right? You might be working on criminal justice reform, but it's also really tied to civic and voter engagement. Or you might be doing housing work, but that's also rooted in different arts and cultural strategies for kind of achieving that, right? So we wanted to make sure that I think at the end of the day, that really reflects the intersectional nature of our equity agenda and how we really want to approach the work and how we also hope grantees are able to see their work in terms of building connections between different strategies from what they're already doing. So in addition to the strategy alignment, other major aspects that we take into deep consideration now, especially now that we're rooted in racial and economic equity, is we take a hard look at the leadership and staff diversity of organizations, right? Are they really being reflective of the communities that they're serving? And why is there a disparate amount of, if an organization doesn't have a lot of people of color on staff, why is that? right? And how can we kind of rectify that together? The other things are along values alignment, really understanding how organizations approach community engagement, and then also, what we've seen too is understanding priorities along geographies and along populations. So right now, we have a really big focus, especially with our criminal justice work, on how do we support formerly incarcerated folks to get job opportunities. Um, Similarly, here in Contra Costa County, knowing that the effects of displacement have moved people from Oakland and San Francisco further out, how are we still rooting people here in Contra Costa by also welcoming the new folks that are being displaced from other parts of the region, but also making sure that that same problem isn't happening here in the county, right? So that's kind of how we're approaching that. And then on the donor advice side of things, I think it's kind of similar, right? I think overall what we're trying to embed is these notions of racial and economic equity. So in addition to really supporting our donors in kind of giving to their own personal interests, we're also doing more of a focus on donor education so that they understand all of the different things that are happening in the Bay Area around racial and economic equity, and so that they can consider or start considering and be encouraged to consider giving to some of these organizations that are doing critical, long-lasting policy change work that hopefully will have tremendous impacts for years to come on Bay Area residents. So that's kind of how we've been approaching it. Yeah.
Perfect. And that's a great segue into hearing a little bit more from Kristen. You touched on what you do as far as donor advised funds, but I think it would be great to hear a little bit more about how that actually works in practice. How do you connect the nonprofits to the donors and encourage them to potentially make a donation to a nonprofit?
So we have about 443 donor advised funds at the Marin Community Foundation. So we have 6 advisors working with all of these different funds. And as I said, each of us has about 75 families in our portfolio. As you'll see in my bio, I sort of describe what we all do with our donors, which is we take our donors on a philanthropic journey. And so impact means something different to every single donor I work with, which is really an interesting thing because if you're working at a foundation, you've sort of identified what impact looks like, but if you're working with an individual family, they will literally call me and say, can you tell me who the best river organization is in the United States? That's how the question goes. Who's the best river organization? Who's protecting rivers most effectively? And then so really our work is to back it up, talk about their values, talk about their interests. We actually have what we call Masters of Philanthropy. It's a curriculum that we've developed to work with our donors. And so we have realized that like foundations, we need to really strategize with our donors a little bit more because the world of nonprofits is so vast that we have to help donors to narrow and be able to say no to certain organizations. So a lot of times when a donor comes to us, their previous giving history might look like $250 here, $500 here, $1,000 here. And our goal as a philanthropic advisors is to say, let's give $50,000 to an organization you really care about. So what that looks like in practice is figuring out what their values are, figuring out what their interests are, developing a mission statement, developing funding strategies, and then identifying the organizations that fit into those strategies. So it's a long process, and once we have gotten to that place, we'll often do a series of site visits or meetings with the nonprofits that seem to fit into their areas of interest, and then continue to develop that relationship as time goes on. I'm trying to think. So the other thing that's worth mentioning is I think people think of the Marin Community Foundation as just this vast amount of money that they are trying to tap, and the median grant size of a donor advised fund grant is about $2,000. So I think that's helpful to kind of manage expectations. With the family foundations I work with, their grant sizes are larger, but for the donor advised fund grants, they tend to be on the more modest side. And what I've also recognized is that as a donor might start with a smaller grant, and once all the things that Eric mentioned, the 8 elements of a successful organization, they've assessed leadership, they know that they're competent, they've heard from another funder that they're doing really great work, all these check boxes have been checked, and then a donor may consider larger grants as time goes on. So that's how I would answer that question.
That's perfect. That's great. Well, that's a great segue to actually hand it back to Eric. You talked specifically about those categories for what helps you encourage, but anything you might want to share more as an individual donor about how you specifically make decisions. And the other thing I thought might be interesting is, as a board chair of an organization, if you have any perspective on how, as a board member, you encourage donations to nonprofit organizations. So.
Thank you. So yeah, I sort of broke my response down between personal and then from what I would call sort of the business level. And without obviously touching again on the 8 factors, that's a piece of it. But again, for me, it's a matter of the relationship of all of those factors, which is the money that I'm going to spend, is it going to be spent wisely? For me, it's really 2 things. And this may not apply to other people, but for me it applies, again, is the personal relationship. But secondly, because of my family's history, family legacy, and things that my family did in this community for 60, 70 years are things I want to continue to carry on. So most of the things I have been involved in, before my father passed away, he was on the Richmond PAL board, he was the head of the Contra Costa College Foundation, he was on a number of different boards. When he passed away, I got asked to be on every single one of them. I had to make a choice. And it was a combination of, I did want to continue the family legacy. I chose the College Foundation just because of other family connections, that I have family members who went to Contra Costa College. So it all mattered to me. There's rarely an organization that's trying to do good in the world. You go, well, that good doesn't matter to me, but that good does. All the good matters. It all matters. So where do you spend the time? That's why, for me, relationships, do I have the confidence? Now I can say, in the case of Contra Costa College Foundation, I took over, my father had started a golf tournament and had raised $100,000 a year through this golf tournament from basically the business community. I took it over and I did it for another 12 years. In the process of doing that, and we averaged netting $100,000 a year at this golf tournament, which is unusual. Usually most people don't make a lot of money in golf tournaments because they're expensive to put on. Contra Costa College District at that time was going through its own stuff and really wasn't focusing on the foundation. Not just our foundation at Contra Costa, they weren't focused on any of their 3 foundations with all their colleges. And I did to them what I would do to a potential, somebody asking me for money. I said, I'm losing interest. With this whole foundation can't be me putting on a golf tournament. This isn't sustainable. And I sort of drew a line in the sand and said, I'm not going to do this anymore unless you guys invest in this foundation. And they did. They hired somebody at the district level who oversees all 3 foundations. They hired development officers for each foundation. And I recommitted from I think I'm leaving to now I'm president of the board, because I'm impressed, and as I am with Stacy, it really matters to me who the development officer is for these organizations, because a lot of times these organizations live or die based on their development officers. And if I have confidence in their development officer, I'm willing to invest in that. I have huge confidence in our new development officer at the college. Her name is Sarah Marcelino. She came from Transform. She's a fireball. She's put completely, this organization went, when I almost walked away a few years ago from having a couple of, maybe $200,000-$300,000 at most in discretionary dollars. We now have $2.5 million of discretionary funds, and we have another $2.5 million of donor-advised funds. So we're now all of a sudden sitting on $5 million, and I tell you, that's not a result of my golf tournament. It's a result of full engagement. So if I sit on a board, and anybody who sits on a board I sit on, you're going to give to this effort. You don't sit here and do nothing. So I did this earlier in my career when I was younger. It's like, oh, I'm on all these boards, but what am I doing? Now I'm like on one board, and we're going to have results, and we're going to have outcome. So I thought, well, the only way I could raise all this money is through this golf tournament. So this last year, I said, I'm not doing the golf tournament. I'm just going to put on a reception in my office, and thinking, well, I don't know how successful this is going to be. Actually netted $125,000. Grossed about 130 because it was cheaper to put it on. And I realized it wasn't about the golf. No, it was about the commitment to the mission of the college. It was about their relationships with me. It was about my history with them over and over. They didn't see that I was in and out. Oh, he's over here, he's over there. No, this guy's been with this foundation for 20 years. He obviously cares about that. So they bought into my commitment. And we also connect them to the college. We bring the students to them. We don't say you got to come to the college and go look at a class. We say, we're going to bring you to an event where you're going to hear from these students. You're going to hear how the money you give us goes to a scholarship to these students that led them to go to this school because they were able to pay for their tuition versus paying for a utility bill, which would have kept them from going to this college. So we make that personal connection with the outcome, and it's, at least in my case, has proven to be successful. Sorry. Am I too long?
No.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No.
Go
I'll add.
go ahead.
No. This is related to this. I got a thank you note actually from a student through funding we gave to Contra Costa College, and it's sitting in my desk because it was a personal note from a student thanking Wells Fargo for the funding we gave and what a difference it made for her. So I just wanted to give you that plug because that I thought that was really nice.
Yeah, exactly, and we do that. We do that. The students do that. Everybody gets a scholarship, does it on their own, and they give it to me. So I also at the college created a fund named after my parents. And I did it to honor them, but I also did it knowing that my family's 70-year history in this community, that people would give to that fund because of their history with my parents or whatever. So, there's always I guess, an emotional and personal part of it, but there's also always, sort of an interest, almost like a self-interest part of it. On the business side, it's a little bit more, when there's a business interest involved, it's different. How do I get my clients to contribute to the community? It's like how I get anybody else to do anything. You have to do it in everybody's interest. So I'll use as an example. I had a project in the city of Pittsburgh where this was 15 years ago, where a client, and their name was Calpine. You may be aware of them. They were basically, this was at the time during the energy crisis, and there was a big demand for new energy sources, and they were building a natural gas power plant in Pittsburgh. And they were interested in being part of the community, and they were like, what do we do? How do we do this? And I came up with an interesting concept that worked fabulously, and I try to replicate it where I can, which is we had them announce that they were going to give away $1 million to the community. But they didn't decide for themselves how they were going to give the money away. They basically created a combination of a community and if you will, an elected official board who they were going to give away the money, because the basic idea was that those people know what their needs of their community more than this company coming into this community. And that we respect the community enough to decide for themselves where they want to spend it. So we let them come up with the criteria. We let them give away the money. The company sat on the board. They made people come and fill out applications and come and make a pitch. If you were asking for $10,000 or more, you had to physically show up. You had to talk about, if we, the board, give you this money, are you going to make sure that the people giving it to you, this company, actually get some credit? Are you going to include them in your materials? That was actually a factor they came up with, not that the company came up with. So it created this sense of ownership. At the end of the day, we established this $1 million community foundation. At the end of the day, it gave away $2.5 million because it was so successful that the company said, you know, we're looking good. The community feels good about it. The elected officials they care about feel good about it. It was a win-win. And so that's, on the business side, an example of how I do it.
Wow, that's a lot of great information you've just gotten from all of these panelists. So hopefully you're feeling like you're getting a lot of insider information here. I have one last question for any or all of the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to some Q&A with guidelines. So, you know, we talked at the proposal writing workshop about how sometimes a organization might say no, like what you were saying earlier about how you might not be aligned. But there are many reasons why a funding request might be denied. Sometimes it is a lack of alignment, but sometimes it's something else. It might be an inadequate information. It might be you know, something that wasn't shared in your application. There might be just a lack of money to go around, not a lack of interest in your organization. So, you know, are you willing to discuss with a nonprofit why you declined their request? And, you know, can you offer any suggestions to this group on what they might do to follow up after a funding request is denied? Anyone?
I guess since I have the mic, I'll start again. One thing I'll, yeah. One thing I will say is Wells Fargo's foundation is on a calendar year. So, little note for you guys, apply early. Because if you come to us in January, you know, we have our full budget. So not to say, you know, obviously if you're not aligned with our priorities, it's not like if you apply in January versus September, we're going to magically give you money. But by the time you get to, you know, September, October, we're almost exhausted our funding. So we're going to be, you know, probably going to be a little more stringent than we would have been potentially in January. But again, I preface that with obviously you're still within our giving guidelines. To answer your question as far as, unfortunately we are not able to sit down and meet with every single organization that gets a decline. That would just be physically impossible. However, I think if you have a very specific question that you want addressed, you know, certainly you can reach out to us of, you know, help me understand what I can do better to increase my chances of receiving funding. The other thing is, just because you were declined in one year doesn't mean you can't apply in a future year. So it's not like that's an automatic, you know, don't come to us ever again. I've definitely seen organizations that we've declined in the past that we now have supported for whatever reason, whether it's, you know, maybe our giving strategy has changed, maybe they applied earlier in the year, or also looking at, I think someone mentioned it, just sort of what are your metrics? You know, so if we're looking at an organization where, you know, what's the impact of that organization? Also, you know, how much are you asking for? Just to give you background, our average grant is about $5,000. And so I think a lot of, you know, like I just got a grant request and someone was asking for, I think like $150,000. And I'm like, ooh. Yeah, that I've never given out a grant at that amount. So you want to be careful about what you're asking for. And I'll immediately look at the organization and say, okay, how much are they asking for? Like, what is the budget? What is that in relation to the size of the organization? And then another thing that came up recently is we do shy away from funding for salary. So we're really looking for program support. So that's something that may be a reason that you get declined, is if you're asking for salary, because our philosophy is we really want to do program support, and if it's salary and we're not able to support you that particular year, a future year, will that mean you're going to have to let go that individual? So those are just some tidbits that I can share.
This is a very timely question. So we're actually in the middle of our open cycle. And so yesterday, I actually had a call with an applicant that was not encouraged or discouraged to submit a full proposal. So for some context, this last open cycle, we received about 460 applications from across the Bay Area. And then we encouraged around 150 to submit a full proposal in our second stage. And the way that we've been approaching grant making is we're trying to give bigger grants and give more general operating support grants, knowing that organizations need the flexibility to do what they need to do, right? So our average grant is around $40,000 through our open cycle. And we're also hoping to do more multi-year funding, so either 2 or 3 year funding to really sustain that work. Obviously, we're still trying to figure out what that actually looks like. This is only our second open cycle under this new kind of equity agenda. But I think mentioning the call that I had yesterday, it was a really tough call because it was an organization that seemed to fit with a lot of the strategies that we were trying to kind of achieve through this open cycle. Yet, of course, the reality was it wasn't as strong as other applicants, and there was just not enough money to go around, right? And I guess for additional context, this organization was doing work around homelessness advocacy in San Francisco. And that's not an explicit issue that we call out through our open cycle. Although, all of the other work that they touch on, whether it's their community organizing work, their civic and voter engagement work, that hit kind of the nail on the wall, right, in terms of what they were doing. But what I said to this applicant was that, it's not a matter of kind of this, lack of alignment with our priorities, but more of just the reality of what we come against as an institution. But I think we had a really fruitful conversation because through that, I think as a community foundation, one of our main charges and responsibilities is to really listen and learn what are the needs in the community, because that's who we're really accountable to. And if homelessness is something that is obviously going to be top of mind for folks, then these calls that we have with folks are really able to inform how our strategies might evolve in the future, right? That's not to say that we might not focus on homelessness next year or the year after, but it's something that we need to keep in mind if this is really what we need to do in order to be responsive to what is happening out there in the community. So that's what I kind of mentioned. And then in addition, in addition to our open cycle, we also have other grant making programs that we have at the foundation. So I always make sure to let folks know about those other opportunities. One of the ones that I constantly mention is the fund that I lead at the foundation, which is our Rapid Response Fund for Movement Building. And that's a smaller grants program. We give around, the grant range is from $3,000 to $15,000. And it's really meant to support frontline social justice groups that are responding to any emerging opportunity or challenge that's happening in the community. And it just so happened that this was something that really aligned with what this organization I called yesterday was doing, so they're hoping to come in the future. So again, I think what we try to do is really connect folks to the different funding opportunities, especially if it's in strong alignment with what we're trying to do as a foundation. I think, again, harkening back to this idea of funders as organizers, we really need to understand what the landscapes are and to be able to connect folks to different opportunities, say that we might not be able to fund it, but I do know someone that might be able to. And it's kind of our responsibility oftentimes to be able to make those connections so that that work can happen.
I totally agree with being the connectors, and I feel like I'm a significant responsibility in being a connector. Again, I'm just going to say that the Buck Family Fund, they do a competitive process, and I think that their process is once a year, and they've already gone through that cycle for the Marin-focused grant making that I was mentioning earlier. They are going with multi-year grants now. They are narrowing their focus significantly, and it's all around equity and focusing on communities in Marin, if you can believe it, that are really struggling and where there's some significant poverty due to the resources in some communities and the lack of resources in other communities in Marin. As far as the Fullerton Family Foundation goes, which is the foundation that's focused in Richmond, I recently had to sunset 12 grantees due to a strategic planning process that we went through and some new funding guidelines, and that was a very difficult experience for me because generally I like to say yes, not no. And it's not easy to have supported an organization for, say, 10 to 15 years and then have to share why this is happening. But I think that I was surprised by the response of the organizations and the thankfulness that they shared for having had the opportunity to receive funding for 15 years, and that they were able to get themselves to a place where they now have additional funders that are coming to the table. So I was actually delighted to realize that they weren't as upset as I thought they would be. And I'm involved in a funders community here over in Richmond. You may be aware that several of us get together on a quarterly basis, and we all sort of share information about nonprofit organizations. And so if something isn't fitting into the Fullerton Family Foundation guidelines, we can often share that with our colleagues who are in this group. And I agree with, we're all trying to talk to one another and trying to collaborate and trying to help you, which ultimately helps the community, which is our end goal here. We're all trying to help raise the dial for everybody. So did I answer the question to yes to no?
That was
or no to
perfect.
yes? We're going to say no to yes, not
That
yes
was
to no.
Eric, do you have anything you want to add? Or?
Unfortunately. Yeah, this is going to piss these people off. So no, hopefully not. But I think, again, from my perspective, it's about, I would recommend trying to be strategic and trying to be creative, because they're getting a lot of asks, and if all these folks meet the criteria, how are you making decisions? I don't know how you're making decisions, but you might have a level playing field, right? So what I would do, I try to never ask a question I don't know the answer to. So I'm not going to try to ask somebody for something that I don't think I have figured out a reason why they're going to give it to me. So if I was going to try to get money out of Wells Fargo, right, and I was going to go online and I saw what their criteria was and I met the criteria, and they go, okay, but why are they going to select us versus somebody else? Now I'm going to try to figure out who's giving away the money. So if you're giving away the money, if Raminder's giving away the money, I'm going to try to find out what I know about Raminder. I'm going to try to find out who she knows, what other boards she sits on, who I know, who I could have casually at some event, walk up to her and say, hey, Eric Zell's involved with this great organization. You really ought to consider, because if out of the formal context, you start to get that third-party validation, and you're, again, trying to make a selection where everything else is equal on paper, so being strategic about it, this is why I said you may not like it, because if somebody comes up to you and talks to you about something I'm involved in, and I'm not talking to you about it, because I'm not going to go directly to you. Before I talk to you, I'm going to, hopefully, you've heard from 2 or 3 other people, and you're going to, oh yeah, I've heard about your organization, you guys are doing a great job. Then I'm hoping that you're closer to yes than you might have been if I had just hit you, anonymously or some other way. So that's being strategic and creative. That's how I would try to avoid a no or a maybe. But if I was going to get a no, if I got a no or a maybe, then I would again sort of up the ante and really try to figure out. I would talk to others who Wells Fargo has given money to and say, well, why were you? We have similar type of organizations and outcomes and capacity. Why'd they give to you and not to me? And try to model somebody else's successful effort to try to get some insight as to, because at the end of the day, I mean, I know you guys all look at criteria, but at the end of the day, you know, there's the human factor. There's the human factor, and that's part of what I'm probably overemphasizing, is that the human factor really matters. If the answer is yes, I know it was part of your question, if the answer is yes, from my experience, especially if it's from a business donor or others, any way you can find to give them credit, do it. If it's in your annual report, if it's through banners at events, if it's through public statements, brochures, most people in the business community want credit for what they're doing, even if they're doing it for the right reasons. So finding every and all ways to give them credit, I can tell you, matters. Because I've had clients of mine saying, well, if I give to them, yeah, it all sounds great, but how are they going to let everybody know we did it? And then I have to really work with that organization and say, okay, let's talk about what you're going to do because one of the ways I'm going to help get you this money is because we're going to figure out how to make them look good in having done it. So that's just a pragmatic reality. So anyway, that's it.
That's what I call insider information. Thank you, Eric.
That's why I'm here.
It's fabulous perspective. Well, and there was the second part. I don't know if any of the other three of you have anything to add about if it is a yes and someone's fortunate enough to get funding from you. Are there particular ways? I know, Raminder, you spoke earlier about some of the ways that they can stay connected with you, you know, not inundating you, but keeping you updated. But are there other specific ways that you guys like to keep in touch with an organization after you've funded them?
Yeah, after making the grant, we usually love learning from grantees about how we can best support them beyond grant dollars, right? So some of the menu of options that we always mention are like, do you have any ideas around trainings, capacity building workshops that might be helpful for your organization? Because we are also very mindful of, you know, helping boost the capacity of orgs to do their work better. Whether there are any kind of convenings on topics that might be most pressing to you all that would be helpful to bring together a group of organizations that are doing similar work so that it could help bolster it in some way. So, you know, I think overall the whole idea is around how do we build deeper collaboration and partnership, and we're always looking for the different ways to kind of do that.
I would just say, in an effort for us to not inundate you as nonprofit organizations, we become very aware as a foundation of not requiring a lot from you. The less reporting, the less application. We recognize that what we really want you to be doing is working on your programs and being strong program directors, not working on the paperwork side. So I think a final report is something that's quite obvious, but we through the Fullerton Family Foundation and many of the other funds, we've simplified the final reporting process to a one-page for significant questions that kind of get at, and if we need to have a deeper conversation with you, we'll give you a call. Events, although I feel like people are getting a little bit burnt out on events, you might be experiencing this, I'm not sure, but I think a lot of donors are being invited to a lot of things, and so they're starting to say no more. I've recognized that's trending. So I'm suggesting that nonprofits create some kind of YouTube, like it can be cheap. You can do a YouTube story about what you're doing or some way that you can keep a donor or a funder up to date on what you're doing. Or if you just had an event at someone's house or an event, send pictures and say, look what just happened, or we just had this convening with the kids, or there was just a graduation with Making Waves. Look at all these kids graduating. Just simple things like that to keep the funder in the loop that aren't too much for you and that we can read quickly and kind of file away.
Anything to add, Raminder? You don't have
No,
to.
I think I sort of covered it earlier.
Great. Well, you can see there's just so much that you've learned today. The only other piece I wanted to just follow up a little on when you said, Raminder, about the grant amounts that you usually fund. A key element of this too is research. particularly with institutional, but there are also ways to research individual donors. Even just Google, it's all sorts of things you can find. But in terms of really figuring out, how to have the most successful approach, so knowing, like for example on GuideStar, you can look up a foundation and see who they funded and what amounts they typically fund. So that way you know that you're asking in about the right range. And like you said earlier about who people know and what they're interested in, and just having any kind of connectivity entry point with somebody is key. And so really doing your research ahead of time is really, really, really important. So that's the one piece I wanted to add in. So those are all of our organized questions, pre-planned. This is your opportunity to ask some questions. Just some guidelines. This is a no-pitch zone. These wonderful panelists have come here to share their information and expertise, but this is not supposed to be an opportunity for you to talk about your own organization specifically. You are going to be able to follow up with them after this if you feel that there's a connection point, and I think some of them might have some time after this to spend here if you have a specific question. But if you have a question as a follow-up that, particularly if you think it might be helpful for other people in the room to follow up on from the nonprofit perspective, I think that would be wonderful. So if we can kind of stick to those kinds of questions, that would be great. And LaShonda has the microphone.
Yes, you have to speak into the mic because we are taping everything so that other people can watch.
Hello, good morning. My name is D.L. Moffett, and I'm a policy fellow for Tech Exchange out of the Oakland Mayor's Office. Whatever, one of those ways. So my question, I'm only here for the summer, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to ask all of you with all of your experience and expertise 2 questions. The first, do federal fiscal initiatives, i.e. cuts to social programs, impact the work of your foundation or donorship? And if so, how? And then the second one is, what do you think the role of federal government is when we have foundations and donors with philanthropic values who can relieve some of the social pressures?
Very deep, very good.
Take this one.
Who wants it first?
So I'll speak for Marin because it's Marin Community Foundation. So our program directors work very closely with the county, and our president of the foundation works very closely with the county. And I would say that for better or for worse, we are filling the gap where federal dollars are not and where county dollars are not. We are very lucky to have $800 million in the Buck Family Fund and then $800 million in the Donor Advised Fund side of the house. So we're a $1.6 billion operation. And as I mentioned earlier, the $800 million in Marin is specifically earmarked for Marin County residents. So I think that we're very, very lucky in our community that we can support services that aren't being supported in other ways. And then the second question, sorry, I can't remember.
What do you think the role of federal government is? Oh, should I? Sorry. Well, the second question is, what do you think the role of federal government is when we have foundations that can release some of the social pressures? Yeah.
I don't know if I have an easy answer to that question. I think I'll pass on that one. Sorry. Maybe you can.
I don't know. I mean, I have my own personal theoretical, opinion about that. Not on the foundation end, but I think in terms of what we're doing as a foundation, we fund less direct service now, understanding that in order to get the wins that we need and to get the quality services that we need, advocacy and policy change is going to be really paramount to that. So our focus has really, and I think I can attest to that by being part of the Power Pathway. It's so rare to have a program area that's really focused on community organizing and civic and voter engagement as a means to create policy change so that we can have a more quality education, public education system, so we can have better health care, so that we can have more affordable housing. So I think that's where we're kind of playing in that role. Not to say that we don't support direct service organizations, but I think the way that we approach that is how do direct service organizations also bridge their connections to their clients and hopefully do some civic engagement work so that they understand, okay, you're receiving these services, these might be under attack, but how do we get those folks galvanized to be able to come out to vote, to get their peers to vote, so that they can vote for the things that will benefit them in the long run. And for the second question, I'd love to share my personal opinion after this Q&A panel.
Yeah, I would just say I think when we do our needs assessments, where we're looking at what are the needs in the community, that sort of factors into that decision of what's happening at the county, state, and federal level. But I would say it's more indirectly. So it factors into the decision, but it's not driving the decision.
I would say it should be a factor because as the federal government is backing out of providing a lot of these services, and that's trickling down in a bad way. I think the way I would use it in my world is certainly to business clients. I'd say, to be blunt, you're benefiting from a lot of these federal policies economically, and so the burden, frankly, is even more in your lap to engage in these communities in a positive way because, frankly, the federal government and other levels of government sometimes are not going to or are going to less, and that you still have an obligation and responsibility to this community. And frankly, you're in a good place. You're in a good position to step up, and so you should. So that's how I'd respond to that question. There's a follow-up.
Sorry, Yeah, and the other thing I would just add also is Wells Fargo did increase its overall giving commitment this year, and part of that was the whole tax reform. So we've committed to giving $400 million nationally to nonprofits throughout the country.
I just wanted to say on the donor side of things that when the new administration came into being and changed our lives forever, the donors, there was a strong desire for donors to know who the organizations were that were serving women and voter, increasing civic engagement. And so we have a 16-page document that we call Philanthropy Rising that donors can actually access and look and see, okay, I care about environment, who are the key players? I care about social justice, who are the key players? And so we have been providing those lists to our donors when they ask for it. And there's been a big increase in support to organizations they've been funding forever to this shift of supporting the organizations that really need it right now. So we've seen a lot of that in the last 2 years.
Yeah. And, in terms of what we can do on the federal level as a community foundation that serves regionally, I think where we make the most impact is where we can do within our region, right? So some of the things that we've been taking up, we've been flexing our lobbying muscle as a community foundation, being able to give more C4 lobbying grants to organizations that are doing work to expand social services here in the Bay Area, right? So for example, we gave a grant to some organizing groups in San Francisco so that they could get universal early child care and education. And right now we're also doing really big investments in the statewide Schools and Communities First campaign, which would reform some parts of our tax system currently and bring about $11 billion to the state that could go to additional social services, whether that's public infrastructure, our schools, health clinics, and so forth. So, really looking, okay, what can we do at the federal level? There's a lot of barriers, but we also have a lot of opportunity to act both at the state and local level.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Grace. I'm with a college access and success org just upstairs, Richmond Promise. And my question is around donor advised funds. So I have read that these types of funds are increasing and that folks are giving more money to donor advised funds for various reasons. And I'm just curious if you all are seeing that trend, if you're anticipating that, and if so, any advice on how to engage those specific types of funds?
You're in the right place. Let's see. So yes, donor advised funds are definitely on the rise. And I think that we've seen, so donor advised funds are offered in a variety of places, like Fidelity provides them, Schwab provides them, and those have low fees. But then you can open a donor advised fund at the Richmond Community Foundation or at the San Francisco Foundation or at the Marin Community Foundation. And oftentimes donors select the community foundation based on where they live or that they care about that community. Others select it because the fees they have to pay for administration are lower in certain places, or they want to have a personal philanthropic advisor like me or someone else at your foundation that can kind of guide them through the process. So again, we can talk offline later. I would have all of your key points prepared, but you basically want to contact the Community Foundation and figure out who the philanthropic services or philanthropic advisors are in the Community Foundation world and speak with somebody personally and let them know what about your program and just provide a one-pager. I would just have a one-pager ready to provide to all the contact you have at each of the community foundations, and then you can just update them. And then they will have that handy when a donor says, I'm interested in college access. Then you can say, great, I just spoke with Richmond Promise, and I happen to know that they provide scholarships to students to head off to school. Let me pull that document out. So that's a proactive way for you to be able to communicate the information without being burdensome in any way.
Hi, I'm Marcia Mather Thrift, Executive Director of Rosie the Riveter Trust, and this is a question for Eric. You've been on many boards of directors, and apart from threatening to resign, what are your top strategies for motivating a board to really build resources, the fullest resources possible for an organization?
That's a good question. We try to get, we're in a board recruitment process right now. So we are vetting, we are figuring out for ourselves how we're going to vet new board members. And it's not, what we have found is it's not just that they might have resources or access to resources. We want them to be committed to the mission. Because if they're not committed to the mission, they're probably not going to be too passionate about it. So we make sure that the mission is strong and core. The other is, and this is where good development folks come in, we do not let these folks off the hook at all. In other words, we get them to sign a commitment for the year of how much they're going to, what they're going to do. Now, it's not always about how much they can give or how much they can even raise. It's about how are you going to plug us into your network? And you don't know is not an option. You want to be on this board, you are acquiescing to giving us access to your world. And you may not think right now that you know people that are going to help us, but a good example is one of our board members, an El Cerrito City Councilwoman, who gave a list to Sarah Marcelino of folks that she knew on her list. It was probably a list she's had for 30 years. Sarah reached out to that list, plugged into somebody who ended up giving us $50,000 and set up an endowment as a Holocaust survivor who I know but didn't connect them to, who this El Cerrito council person didn't even remember was on her list. So we know it's not that not everybody can raise money, not everybody can give money, but everybody knows other people, and you never know what's going to come out of mining that process. And so if you don't meet that commitment over a period of time, basically in your first year on the board, we're going to probably say this isn't a good fit, and we're going to move them off the board, and we're going to go find somebody who does fit.
And I do also want to state that on our website, we had a really good training about board recruitment and retention. So we videotaped it, so if you want to watch it, please do so.
I think it's pretty common that a question accurately defined is part of the answer. So I'm going to apologize for not having my question very well defined. But I think it's probably other people in the room have the same question. So how do you look at yourself in terms of your self-identity as an organization, in terms of stages of development? In other words, we have now been given a grant, and we now have a renewed contract with the school district. On the other hand, we're still a one-man shop. And so I've always looked at myself as being a startup, but I think we're a little bit beyond that, but we're not far enough that we can afford to hire anybody. And so I would think how you properly evaluate yourself and how you're looked upon by the funders in terms of your organizational development. And the last thing I'd say, and I think this probably happens, I've had a pretty significant advisory board that has been very sensitive in saying, George, you really need to focus more. And I cut my hand to the side when they're not looking and said, yeah, but I'm focused on 15 things. So this in-between stage, I think, is a real area where it's really hard to figure out what to do.
So, excellent question, and thank you for keeping us on our toes. I think that we as funders are starting to recognize the importance of general operating support, the importance of capacity building for nonprofits, the cost of living in the Bay Area and what that means for nonprofits' success and survival. And I think that all of us have sort of started trying to educate our donors around that too. So I have several donors who, when they're thinking about impact, they're thinking about actually supporting smaller organizations like yours because they feel like they can make a bigger difference, and they know that they know exactly where their dollars are being spent versus sending it to the UCLA, not UCLA. Sorry, not UCLA. Go Bruins. So, like a large organization, Planned Parenthood or you name it, where it's like, where did the money go? But some people do like that because of leadership and stability and financial health. But I think there's two types of donors, and there's those who really want to support that small organization, and then there's those, and those who support the smaller organization are there for the long haul, and they're willing to kind of say they need a development person, they need some support, they need some capacity building support. So I think just hang in there, and maybe think about, okay, that's all I have to say is hang in there.
So actually, I could speak a little bit about Richmond Community Foundation. If all of you have seen that we sent out an e-blast recently that many of you might have received. We were in a very similar state to what you're describing. We were larger staff than a one person, but it was a similar moment in time where we were focused on way too many things and having to look at how we build our sustainability for the future. A lot of it was prompted by thinking about how do we build a fundraising base, per all the things that Eric was talking about in those 8 points. recognizing we didn't necessarily have all those things clearly defined. And here we were in the community telling everyone how to build your sustainability, because we were so focused on giving everything we had away and supporting all the organizations in our community. We had to look at ourselves, and I think my mom years ago said, it's not selfish to take care of yourself. And that was a little bit of what we had to do, because if we really want to be a stronger organization to support all of you, we need to be really clear on how we can do that best. And what we went through a process, we were fortunate enough, but we had to build our case first so that we could get funding, so that we could get the expert support we needed to be able to really have the help to look inside and figure out what it is we do best and where we should best build and support our organization. Because we had an opportunity to hire new staff, but we didn't want to just hire staff. We wanted to make sure that we knew exactly what it is we want to do long term, where we were going to have the most impact, and hire those specific people to do those specific things. So we had to do that same process that you're describing, and it's really, it's critically important. That's part of the finding the alignment too. Because now what we recognize is we can really focus our fundraising and marketing efforts, et cetera, on exactly the audience that we know is going to be interested in supporting us. Same thing with building our board. We had a very unfocused board because we had a very unfocused organization. But now our current board is still with us. They are jazzed, they are excited, they are all in. And the new people we're looking at bringing on our board are people that are going to buy into what we are all about, because we know what we're all about. So it's really the critical thing to do is really know who you are as an organization. What are the needs you're meeting in the community? What can you do in the best possible way so that you can allocate your resources and your staff resources, each of you and your board, your human resources. Eric keeps talking about the human factor. In my opinion, and the years that I've been in this field, it's the most critical and the most undervalued in many ways. We all look at money, but the relationships, that's why this panel was called Relationship Building. The human relationships, I think, are, there's so many different ways you can leverage those for greater good in the community. Just look at what San Francisco Foundation is doing in terms of building the community organizing and support, what we can all do together. So, yeah, that's my soapbox and pitch, but yeah.
I'm coming.
Hi, I'm Tina Bostic. So this is all new to me, but my question is, does the organization have to be established for a period of time before they can ask for donations, or can it be a new organization?
So there isn't like a requirement that you need to be established for X number of years or anything like that. We do need you to have a 501c3 status. There are sometimes organizations where they're relatively new and they have a fiscal agent 501c3. We do support those types of organizations. However, there's you want to prove yourself a little bit, so we do support those organizations, but it'll raise a bit of a question, and again, it'll be more, how do you fit in within our giving guidelines? And then also, I think I would say, for us, what is your organization doing that's maybe unique and innovative and different? So meaning if you're saying you're supporting, affordable rental housing in Oakland, and there's several organizations that are doing affordable rental housing in Oakland, why would we support your organization as opposed to maybe the 6 other organizations that are doing the exact same thing? So maybe you're saying, okay, we're doing affordable rental housing in Oakland, but we're also have a workforce component. So the program is actually helping them find affordable housing, but also they're working and getting training at the property to become a property manager or to be, to become a janitor. So anyways, how are you distinguishing yourself? I think that's going to be really important.
Yeah, I'll have to agree with what Raminder said. So at the foundation, like I mentioned, I lead the Rapid Response Fund for Movement Building, and that's actually one of our grant programs where we encourage new organizations to come through, especially a lot of smaller grassroots efforts, right? And so many of the grantees that we've funded through this have no full-time staff, are either volunteer-driven, but really make their case about being a distinguished entity to do the work that they're outlining to do, right? Like what we ask ourselves during our review sessions is this the organization that can do the work, and are they the organization that will be able to do it well, right? But same things, right? You need to have 501c3 status or either be a fiscally sponsored project of a 501c3. So I think that's really important in order for your organization to get the funds dispersed to you. So I think that's always a critical step, especially if you're just starting out and becoming a fiscally sponsored project, finding an organization that will be able, that you build a relationship with and that will trust you to do the work that you're outlining to do.
I would just reiterate what both of them just said and just say that that's where it really comes down to competency again. And so really being able to articulate your mission, being able to articulate what your programs are, to show that you're a proven leader. And then the things that anytime we have a nonprofit conversation, when people call us and say, I want to talk to you for a half an hour and tell you about my program, we always say, what are the 3 top things that every donor should know about your organization? You should be able to answer that right away. What differentiates you as an organization with all the other players in the field? And then if you have a development plan or a strategic plan, that's going to show us that you've actually done some legwork and that you've really started to think about what your goals are. So obviously, if you're a one-person shop, it's going to be really hard. But if you have developed some of those drafts and are able to share them, I think that really shows us that that you're serious.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Neil Zarchin with the Food Bank of Contra Costa and Solano. And Kristen, you touched on this point a little bit, but I'd like to direct others. We're a medium-sized organization that funds in several different geographical areas and has multiple programs. And your idea of the one-pager for the different philanthropic advisors really speaks to me about. But I'd like to raise the issue of it's really burdensome to fill out different applications for different regional areas. I know we work with Randy Chun with Wells Fargo. And is there any kind of movement towards consolidating applications across programs or across geographies that would make it, that would really reduce the time in a medium-sized nonprofit?
So to clarify, you're saying meaning Wells Fargo Foundation, San Francisco Foundation, Marin Community Foundation?
No, I'm talking about filling out an application for West Contra Costa County, filling out an application for Central or Eastern Contra Costa County, filling out an application for Solano County, all within the same, within Wells Fargo, or I know we do this with Kaiser and other large or medium-sized funders.
I think the challenge is we make decisions locally. So the thing is, if you're applying for more than one region within Wells Fargo, as an example, you can only apply, or not you can only, but you would just apply once. But in there, you would share the work that you're doing in those various areas. So meaning if you're based in Concord, which I believe you are, you would come to our East Bay Inland region. You would submit a request. And in that, you would stipulate, okay, here's the work that we're doing. So let's say you're doing work in Stockton. So you would stipulate, first of all, you'd want to establish a relationship with the reminder that's in Stockton. So that when I approach them and say, hey, Jerry, Contra Costa Solano Food Bank is looking for a grant from your area. If they're like, well, I've never heard of them, I don't know what they do, the odds are not great that you're going to get funding from them. But if you approach us and say, hey, remember, we're looking to get funding from other areas because we're doing all this fantastic work in Stockton, and I do this on a regular basis, I'll say, okay, great, let me connect you with Jerry, and then you have a connection with her, and you're sharing what you do. So then when you submit the one request, in it you're stipulating, okay, we're asking for, $5,000 in the East Bay, and it's going to serve 500 people, and this is what it's going to do. And then I'm asking for $3,000 from, San Joaquin County, and it's going to serve these people. So it is one request, but you have to keep in mind that if you're asking for dollars from other areas, because I would do the same thing. If Jerry says to me, hey, I've got an organization in Stockton that's doing work in Livermore, and they don't have any information for me of what they're doing, how do I assess them? So you do have to provide that information so that the foundation can make an informed decision.
But you do, with one application, can cover multiple geographies. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Generally speaking, yes.
Wow, thank you.
So that's, but we can certainly talk offline just to double check.
Anyone else have a? Perfect.
Keep the microphone here and keep it in your hands, Raminder.
Okay.
My name is Eric A. Holm. I'm the executive director with Yes Nature to Neighborhoods here in Richmond. And I know that Wells Fargo also provides sponsorships, or has in the past. I don't know if the sponsorship application is similar to the community grants application, or if it's something totally different, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that
Sure.
process.
So one thing that we've tried to do in recent years is we've really tried to do less sponsorships and more program support. Not to say that we don't do sponsorships. So when you say sponsorships, are you talking about like a gala or an event or something like that? So yeah, I would say we try to do less of those events and more of program. So especially for an organization where we haven't supported you in the past, I wouldn't start off with a gala or a sponsorship. I would say, is your program fit within our guidelines, and start with program support. So I would say that would be the start. There is a separate marketing group that does sponsorships, but they're very, very specific. They work with chambers and do things like a festival, or things that really are about getting our brand out there. But for the most part, for nonprofits, I'd say we really try to focus on that program support. So I wouldn't start off with sponsorship.
Hi, I'm Sally from the San Francisco Beacon Initiative. One of you mentioned that you invite people to give a blurb about yourself before applying to an open application process. Is that true for everyone? Is that recommended? So that you're applying to the right strategy, or you basically fit?
I think I mentioned that, right? Yeah, I think I mentioned that. And, oftentimes, again, like my philosophy on philanthropy is to lessen the burden on grantees to do the work so that they can focus more on the work that they're doing. So if so I definitely encourage short blurbs beforehand, before submitting a larger application that may take a few hours to complete, right? Because at least that way you'll either have this signal that let's go ahead and do it, or this might not be the best fit. So, focus the time on the work.
Yeah, I would just say relationships. I mean, it's all about that today. And so if you can have a conversation on the phone, that's probably going to be better than an email. If you can meet in person, that's probably going to be better than talking on the phone. If you can say hello to somebody at an event and, you know, have a personal conversation, they're going to remember you. Those are the types of things you really want to have happening. And the blurb, so with Fullerton Family Foundation, it's not a competitive process. So actually, it's an invite only. But I do have some folks that if they have heard through the grapevine that Fullerton supports this and that, I will never turn somebody away if they want to have a conversation with me. And I'm an East Coaster, and so I'm pretty straightforward. I don't, you know, I'll tell you like it is. So, and I think that, but the blurb does help, and being able to summarize, you know, I'm planning on applying for this. Do you think it's a good fit? Is the best way to go.
Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, it depends. I mean, if you're an organization, sometimes I do ask for that, depending on the organization. If it's like, hey, remember, we're thinking about doing something new and different, and I just want to get my head around it. And I don't want them to go ahead and submit a complete application to just say, okay, send me, or it could be where they're like, I've got all the 5 ideas of what I could submit a grant for. And it's like, okay, well, maybe just send me, you know, 2 or 3, and I can take a quick look at them and go, okay, I think this is the one that's, you know, the most likely to be supported. But I always caution people with, you know, that doesn't certainly guarantee funding. It's just, I will take a look at it and see which of these will, you know, likely align with our giving strategy.
Well, terrific. I think that's a great way to end this amazing panel. We thank each of you so much for taking the time today. Yes, a big round of applause for all 4 of them. We really appreciate it. You know, I think you all have really gained a lot of amazing insight. I know I did too. So we really appreciate your all being here today too. We are passing out evaluation forms right now. We would really appreciate if you just take a quick minute and fill them out. It really helps us as we develop these sessions moving forward to know what to incorporate and what not to. And I also just wanted to mention we have 2 more of these sessions coming up. They're on your program. The next one on September 20th on staff retention and engagement in nonprofit settings. And then the one after that is going to be on social media from Facebook and YouTube with Jason Hansen, who's wonderful and has done a lot of work with us. So you can get some real insider perspective on both of those topics. So we hope you'll join us. I know the panelists are going to stick around at least for a couple minutes. So if you have specific questions, now is your chance. And thanks so much for joining us.